Lonely soldier met a boy at the bus station on Christmas night, and the truth left him speechless. On the loneliest night of the year, a weary soldier walked into a bus station, expecting nothing more than silence and passing time. But when his eyes caught a small boy curled up on the cold floor, trembling in the shadows, he made a choice that would alter two lives forever. What seemed like a fleeting encounter on Christmas Eve revealed a heartbreaking truth that left him speechless, and began a journey neither of them could have imagined. Moved by this story? Subscribe, hit like, and comment to inspire others. The bus station that Christmas Eve carried the weight of silence. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow over rows of metal benches. A December wind slipped through the automatic doors, sharp enough to cut through coats and scarves, and every announcement echoing from the loudspeaker sounded hollow, like prayers repeated without faith. The clock above the ticket counter read 11:48 p.m. The world outside celebrated, but here there was only departure and delay, faces passing without recognition. Miguel sat hunched on one of the benches, his hood pulled low, a worn backpack leaning against his legs. He had once worn a uniform that gave him purpose, but now all he carried were invisible scars and an ache that seemed older than he was. Messages from old comrades had gone unanswered. Invitations to holiday gatherings remained unopened. It was easier to say nothing than to explain the emptiness. He had an address but no home, a body present but no place he belonged. That was when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the sterile station air. A muffled sob, quickly stifled, then another. It was the sound of loneliness given voice. Miguel looked up, scanning the platforms. At the far edge, half hidden by shadow, a small figure sat against a pillar, knees tucked close, head bowed. The soldier's instincts moved faster than his thoughts. He rose, crossed the tiled floor, and stopped a few paces away. The boy was no older than 8. His jacket was too thin for the cold, his sneakers frayed, and his tiny hands clutched the straps of a faded backpack. His eyes, wide and dark, flicked toward Miguel with the caution of someone who had learned not to trust too easily. Miguel lowered himself slowly to the ground, choosing not to tower over him. He leaned back against the pillar, keeping a respectful distance. For a long moment, there was only the sound of a bus engine coughing to life and rolling away. The boy's lips trembled as though he wanted to speak, but fear sealed the words. Miguel understood. Before any questions there had to be warmth. He stood again and walked to the last food stall still open, returning minutes later with 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate and a paper bag carrying the scent of fresh bread. He set one cup down near the boy and took a careful sip of his own. The boy's gaze followed the rising steam. Slowly, cautiously he reached for the cup. His first sip was tentative, then another followed and color returned to his cheeks. He ate in silence, but with the quiet intensity of hunger that had waited too long. It was only then, with hands warmed by the drink, that he whispered his name, Lucas. His voice was soft, as though afraid the sound itself might disappear. He said he had been waiting for his grandmother, but the hesitation in his tone betrayed the truth. With gentle persistence, Miguel listened as fragments emerged. A mother who had left long ago, a father unknown, a grandmother who had been the only anchor but was now gone as well. Lucas admitted he had no ticket, no place to go. He had tried to rest on benches, but security guards pushed him away. He dreaded the possibility of being taken by the authorities, shuffled from one foster placement to another, never wanted long enough to stay. His small fingers clenched around the cup as though it might vanish like everything else had. Miguel felt the boy's words strike chords deep within his own chest. He remembered the hollow weight of loss, the loneliness that gnawed without mercy. The boy's trembling shoulders mirrored the isolation Miguel had known for years. The loudspeaker called out the last departure of the night, and silence swallowed the station once more. Miguel looked at Lucas and knew the decision had already been made inside him. There was no leaving him here. To walk away would be to abandon him to the cold, to the system, to despair. He rose to his feet and extended a hand. It wasn't an order, but an invitation. Lucas hesitated, studying the weathered hand before him. Finally, his small palm pressed into Miguel's. It was cold, fragile, yet steady. Together, they walked through the corridor, their footsteps falling into rhythm. Outside, the December wind bit harder, but the air carried something else now, a shift, faint yet undeniable, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Around the corner, a small food truck still glowed with light, a radio crackling with a Christmas carol from another era. Miguel bought soup and bread, and Lucas cradled the bowl as if it were a treasure. Between spoonfuls, he murmured that his grandmother used to say bus stations held promises, because they were places where people either left or returned. Miguel thought about it, then replied that sometimes the promise wasn't leaving or returning at all, but someone choosing to stay. When they stepped back into the street, the boy carried the remaining bread wrapped tightly in paper, unwilling to let it go. Miguel unlocked his car and looked down at him. This night would not end with the boy curled up on a station bench. Not while he was here. There would be a sofa, a locked door, a blanket, and safety. Lucas's eyes widened, startled by the offer, but behind the fear flickered something else. Hope, fragile and trembling yet alive. As the car rolled through rain-slick streets reflecting holiday lights, Miguel realized that life's promises rarely came in tidy packages. Sometimes they appeared in the most unexpected places, in the weary eyes of a child on a freezing night. And as he drove toward his small apartment, he knew with unshakable certainty, everything had just changed. The car carried them through streets glistening with rain, every puddle reflecting fragments of holiday lights strung across balconies and storefronts. Behind those windows, families gathered around tables, their laughter spilling out faintly into the night. Inside Miguel's car, however, there was silence. Not the heavy kind of silence that suffocates, but the fragile kind that waits, unsure if it can trust the moment. Lucas sat curled against the door, clutching the paper-wrapped bread as though it were a lifeline. His eyelids fought against the weight of exhaustion, but each time his head dipped forward, he snapped it back up again, unwilling to let himself drift. Miguel watched out of the corner of his eye. The boy's determination to stay awake revealed a fear deeper than words could explain, the fear of closing his eyes and waking up abandoned. When they reached Miguel's building, the soldier parked beneath a flickering streetlight. For a moment, he hesitated, staring at the door that led upstairs. That apartment had been nothing more than 4 walls and a roof since he'd moved in. Functional, silent, stripped of memories by design. He had lived like a man waiting out a storm that never ended. But tonight, stepping into that space would mean something else entirely. He opened the door and led Lucas up the narrow staircase. The boy followed cautiously, eyes darting as though measuring escape routes. When Miguel unlocked his apartment and pushed the door open, warm air greeted them, carrying the faint scent of detergent and dust. The space was small, almost bare. A worn couch, a plain table, shelves lined with practical items, but no photographs, no decorations, no traces of a life once imagined. To Miguel, the apartment had always felt like a shelter rather than a home. To Lucas, however, it was warmth and safety compared to the cold concrete of the bus station. His gaze lingered on the couch as though it were the softest bed he'd ever seen. Miguel set his keys on the counter and placed a blanket across the couch cushions. He spoke gently, explaining that Lucas could rest here tonight, that the door would remain locked, and that no one would take him away while he slept. The boy nodded silently, still gripping the bread. Miguel went to the kitchen, opened a cupboard, and found a can of soup he had nearly forgotten. The ritual of heating it filled the apartment with a comforting aroma. When he returned to the living room, he set a steaming bowl on the small table. Lucas climbed onto the couch and ate slowly, each spoonful measured as though he feared the food might vanish before he could finish. The soldier watched him, remembering the long nights in his own past when meals were hurried rations and warmth was a rare luxury. He recognized the way Lucas tried to stretch out each bite, the instinct of someone who had learned to expect scarcity. Quietly, Miguel told him there was more in the kitchen if he wanted it. For the first time, the boy's eyes lifted, glistening, uncertain whether to believe. After the meal, Miguel guided Lucas to the bathroom. The boy's face, pale and smudged with dirt, softened under the stream of warm water. Miguel handed him one of his smallest shirts, which hung on the child like a nightgown, and a pair of socks rolled at the ankles. Clean and bundled, Lucas looked both fragile and new, as though the simple act of bathing had peeled away days of cold and fear. Back in the living room, Lucas sank into the couch, pulling the blanket up to his chin. He still held the bread in one hand, but his body betrayed its exhaustion. Miguel dimmed the lights, sat in the chair nearby and leaned back. The boy's breathing slowed, uneven at first, then steadier as sleep claimed him. Miguel remained awake, staring at the small figure curled beneath the blanket. The room, usually hollow and indifferent, now carried a heartbeat that was not his own. For 3 years, he had lived in silence, convincing himself he didn't need anyone, that isolation was easier than facing the pain of loss. Yet here, on this Christmas Eve, a child who had nothing had brought warmth into the very place Miguel had stripped of feeling. Memories stirred. The barracks, the smell of sand and smoke, the faces of soldiers he had led. The phone calls he had ignored after leaving service. The woman he had once imagined building a family with, whose laughter he still heard in quiet hours. Life had taught him to expect departures, not arrivals. But tonight something shifted. He looked at Lucas again. The boy's small hand twitched as though reaching for something in a dream. Miguel leaned forward, pulled the bread gently from his grasp and set it on the table. Then he tucked the blanket tighter around him, whispering words he hadn't spoken in years, words meant to promise safety, though the boy was too deeply asleep to hear. The clock on the wall struck midnight. It was Christmas Day. Outside, fireworks cracked faintly in the distance, celebrating joy that neither of them had expected to find. Inside, Miguel sat in silence, watching over a child he had met less than 2 hours ago, yet who already stirred something long buried within him. He didn't know what the morning would bring, or how complicated the days ahead might become. But for the first time in years, Miguel felt a reason to stay awake, not out of habit but out of purpose. He knew one thing with certainty: this boy would not face the night alone again. And with that unspoken vow, the soldier leaned back in his chair, listening to the steady rhythm of the boy's breathing, as the first fragile threads of belonging began to weave themselves through the quiet of his empty apartment. Dawn entered quietly, seeping in through the thin blinds and laying soft stripes of gold across the living room. The fireworks had faded hours ago, leaving only the distant hum of a city catching its breath after a night of celebration. In the chair, Miguel woke to a stiffness along his spine and the impression that the room itself had changed overnight. The couch still held a small hill beneath the blanket. The slow rise and fall told him Lucas was asleep. For a moment he didn't move. He simply listened, as if the boy's breathing were proof that the night had not been a dream. The apartment looked different in morning light. The bare walls softened, the modest furniture seemed less severe. There was a second presence now, a new center of gravity around which the air arranged itself. Miguel stood and stretched, careful not to startle the child, then stepped into the kitchen. He let water run in the kettle, opened a cupboard and took stock of what little he had: oatmeal, a few eggs, bread, an apple. It would do. He cracked the eggs into a pan, the sound gentle and domestic, a quiet he had not known in years. A rustle came from the living room. He looked over his shoulder and saw Lucas bolt upright, eyes wide, the blanket clenched in both fists. The boy did not speak. He scanned the room as if trying to locate exits, threats, proof. The scent of cooking reached him first. The next thing he saw was Miguel's face, calm, unhurried, turned toward him without surprise. The soldier lifted the spatula a fraction in greeting. No questions, no demands. Just a morning beginning. Lucas relaxed by degrees that could have been measured. He rubbed his eyes and slid his feet to the floor, socked toes skimming the rug. The bread he had clutched through sleep was still on the side table, wrapped in its paper cocoon. He looked at it, then at the stove, then back at the door, checking whether it was still locked from the inside. It was. Miguel plated eggs and a slice of toast, set them on the table and added a glass of water. He placed a folded napkin beside the plate, as if the neatness itself might offer reassurance. Lucas approached with the cautious steps of someone entering new terrain. He sat but did not pick up the fork. Miguel poured hot water over tea leaves, the steam lifting like quiet vows. The first words of the morning belonged to the room, the kettle settling, the building warming, a pipe ticking in the wall, until Lucas, barely above a whisper, asked if people came through the door without knocking. Miguel shook his head. The boy asked if someone could take the key while they slept. The soldier, without drama, took the key from the hook, placed it in the middle of the table between them and said nothing. Lucas stared at the key for a long breath, then ate, every bite measured, every swallow careful not to empty the plate too quickly, as though vanishing breakfast might pull the promise away with it. After the meal, Miguel rinsed the dishes and left the water running so the sound would keep pace with the quiet. He found a small notepad in a drawer and a dull pencil that had survived moves and decluttering. He wrote down a list he didn't know he had been carrying in his head for hours. Call the hotline, ask about emergency placement, ask for next steps, ask for paperwork, ask for time. He did not write "ask if I can do this." He already knew the answer. Lucas wandered to the window, parted the blinds with 2 fingers, and watched a woman walk a dog past the building. The leash was a bright red loop in a pale morning. He let the blinds fall back into place and turned to the bookshelf, a spare collection of manuals, a few paperbacks, a photograph frame with nothing inside. He touched the empty frame and set it upright as if emptiness too deserved to stand. Miguel made a plan for the first hour because plans were the scaffolding on which he had rebuilt himself in other lives. He would call first, he would keep his voice even, he would ask for names and write them down. He would speak clearly so the words could not be misunderstood. He would not let anyone hurry him off the line. And he would do all of it with the boy within sight, so no moment felt like a disappearing act. When he picked up the phone, Lucas flinched. The soldier lowered it again, then moved to the table and set the device face up, beside the key, as though both objects, authority and access, belonged to the center of their temporary world. Only then did he dial. The voice on the other end was professional, tidy, wrapped in procedures. Miguel explained the night, the station, the cold, the name, the age, the absence of anyone to call. He did not plead, he reported. He listened as the voice listed steps. An intake, a visit, a temporary placement evaluation. The words were familiar in their structure. Orders by another name. He repeated them back, asked for time frames and wrote them down. When the call ended, he placed the phone precisely where it had been and looked at Lucas. He said that people would come by. He said he would be here when they did. He did not promise what he could not control, only what was his to give. Lucas nodded, but fear returned, small and sharp, like glass at the edge of a shoe. He wandered to the bathroom, and when he returned, he carried his backpack to the couch and slid it under the cushion until only a corner showed. The gesture was quick, reflexive, a tiny fortification. Miguel pretended not to notice, the same way one does not call attention to a bandage that needs time. An hour stretched and softened. They found a rhythm without declaring one. Miguel swept the kitchen floor. Lucas arranged the two cushions on the couch until their corners aligned. The soldier opened a window to let in new air. The boy closed it halfway to keep the room from feeling too exposed. Between them, a negotiation of light and safety took place without a single raised voice. Mid-morning arrived with a knock. Lucas snapped to attention, hands gripping the couch back. Miguel stood and went to the door. He looked back only once, not to ask permission, but to offer a steadying glance that said, "I remain." He opened the door half a span and met the calm faces of two people. A social worker with a clipboard and a man in a plain jacket holding a folder. Their smiles were gentle, professional, practiced at the edge of hard stories. They entered with careful steps, introduced themselves and took seats at the table. The key still rested there, a small metal certainty between them. Questions followed, soft but precise. Names, dates, places, what was said and by whom. Miguel answered plainly. Lucas sat very still, as if stillness could make him smaller and therefore safer. When they asked the boy a question directly, Miguel did not speak for him. He only shifted his chair back an inch so the child could see more of the room and less of the forms. The social worker examined the apartment with the eyes of someone trained to measure safety in details. Locks, hot water, sharp edges, the distance between bed and window. She noted the couch and the blanket folded at its foot. She watched the way the boy tracked the soldier's movements, and the way the soldier kept his voice level even when the questions brushed old wounds. They stood to leave after promising a follow-up by afternoon. At the door, the man in the plain jacket hesitated and said that the next steps would include a temporary placement assessment. He spoke as if offering a bridge rather than a verdict. Miguel thanked them. Not because gratitude was expected, but because their presence, organized, orderly, human, meant the morning had not dissolved into uncertainty. When the door closed, Lucas released the breath he had been holding. Miguel returned to the table and set a second list beneath the first. It was shorter: buy more food, find warmer clothes, make room for another life. He could not see beyond the day, but he could manage its edges. The sun climbed, the apartment warmed. The boy drifted back to the window and watched the red leash pass again, the same woman, the same dog, the small order of ordinary life circling the block. He let the blinds fall and turned toward the soldier. The question in his eyes had not changed since the night before, but now it came without words. "Will you still be here when they return?" Miguel nodded once, a promise sealed without ceremony. Outside, the city gathered itself for the slow hours of Christmas Day. Inside, two lives adjusted their breathing, learning how to share a room, a table, a silence that no longer threatened to swallow them whole. And in that measured quiet, the day unfolded like a map neither of them had expected to read. Afternoon light softened the edges of the apartment, filtering through blinds in gentle stripes. The air smelled faintly of soap and warm bread, the remains of lunch lingering on the table. For a few precious hours, the world outside seemed distant, reduced to the muffled hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Yet within those walls, tension coiled like a thread pulled too tight, ready to unravel at the slightest tug. Lucas sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath him, clutching a pillow to his chest. His eyes darted from the door to the window, scanning for movements that might signal change, as though at any moment the safety of the room could be revoked. Miguel, sitting at the table with his notepad, pretended to study the scribbled lists but was really watching the boy. He recognized that look, hypervigilance born of loss, the instinct to prepare for abandonment before it happened. It was a look he had worn himself once, in desert barracks and sleepless hospital corridors. The knock, when it came, was soft but undeniable. Lucas stiffened, the pillow tightening against his ribs. Miguel rose calmly, his movements deliberate, and went to the door. He opened it just enough to reveal the social worker from the morning, now accompanied by a woman with a large satchel. Their smiles were professional, practiced in the art of gentleness. Miguel stepped aside and they entered with careful greetings. The woman with the satchel introduced herself as a counselor, explaining that she had been assigned to evaluate the boy's immediate needs. She asked if they could sit together, if Lucas might be comfortable answering a few questions. The boy didn't move, didn't nod or shake his head. He seemed to shrink into the fabric of the couch. Miguel stayed where he was, a steady presence at the table, close enough for the boy to see, far enough to let him choose. At last, Lucas gave the smallest of nods and the counselor began. Her questions were simple at first: what foods he liked, whether he had slept, if he felt warm enough, but soon they reached the fragile edges of his story. When she asked about his grandmother, Lucas's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers dug into the pillow until his knuckles whitened. He whispered that she had been sick, that one morning she simply didn't wake up, and that people in uniforms had come and taken her away. His voice faltered on the last words, breaking like glass under strain. Miguel's chest tightened. He could almost see the scene: a boy shaking the frail body of the only anchor he had left, calling a name that would never answer again. He remembered his own moments of finality, the seconds when news stripped the world of meaning. Loss recognized loss. He wanted to cross the room to shield the child from the weight of memory, but he stayed still, knowing this was a story that had to be told in the boy's own time. The counselor's notes were quick but quiet, her face composed yet not cold. She thanked Lucas, reassured him that his words mattered, and explained that he would not be left alone again. She promised to return in the coming days, to help both him and Miguel navigate what lay ahead. Then she rose, her satchel heavy with forms, and followed the social worker out, leaving behind the faint scent of paper and ink. When the door closed, silence returned like a tide. Lucas stared at the carpet, the pillow slack in his arms now. Miguel crossed the room and crouched before him, careful not to invade the boy's space. He said only that he had heard him, that he was proud of his courage. Lucas blinked, uncertain what to do with words of affirmation. Slowly, hesitantly, he set the pillow aside and leaned forward until his forehead rested briefly against Miguel's shoulder. It was not an embrace, not yet, but it was the beginning of trust. Miguel did not move until the boy pulled back, and even then, he offered no words, only the quiet certainty of presence. The rest of the afternoon passed in small gestures. Miguel showed Lucas how to fold the blanket neatly, how to stack dishes without breaking them, how to water the single plant on the windowsill. Lucas followed each instruction with careful precision, as though performing duties in a new regiment. For the first time, Miguel recognized something familiar. The boy's survival instincts mirrored his own, the discipline of someone who had learned early to adapt or vanish. As evening fell, Miguel prepared another simple meal. Lucas ate more freely this time, though he still glanced often at the door. Afterward, Miguel turned on the small television, the screen filling the room with muted light. A holiday special played, voices too cheerful for the atmosphere, but Lucas watched intently, absorbing the brightness like someone starved for color. Miguel let it play even when it grated on him because the boy's eyes softened with every scene. When it grew late, Miguel guided him back to the couch, adjusting the blanket once more. Lucas clutched the bread he had saved, still unwilling to let go. Miguel didn't pry it from his hands this time. Instead, he sat again in the chair, the silent guardian of the night. The boy's breathing slowed, settling into the rhythm of sleep. Outside, the city glittered with Christmas lights. Inside, a soldier and a child drifted into the fragile peace of a new beginning. Neither knew how long it would last or what obstacles awaited them, but both carried the same quiet hope, that perhaps, for once, morning would not take away what night had given. And as Miguel watched the boy sleep, he realized something he hadn't dared to believe in years. He was no longer entirely alone. Morning arrived with gray skies and the faint smell of rain drifting through the open window. The city stirred slowly, still recovering from Christmas Day, while inside the apartment a fragile routine had already begun. Miguel brewed coffee, its sharp aroma filling the air, and placed a small bowl of cereal on the table for Lucas. The boy ate quietly, still cautious, still watching every move as if testing whether safety could truly last longer than a single night. When breakfast ended, Miguel opened the notepad he had kept close since the first phone call. Lines of names, numbers, and procedures filled the pages, each one a wall he would need to climb if Lucas was to stay. He began dialing numbers, his voice steady, each call answered by officials who spoke in careful tones and carried authority in their clipped words. He explained again and again, a child alone at the bus station the night of Christmas Eve, the absence of family to claim him. Each time the response was the same, forms to complete, evaluations to schedule, interviews to conduct. Bureaucracy built its paper walls brick by brick, demanding patience where urgency should have lived. Miguel listened, wrote, and repeated, though frustration pulled at him. Lucas sat nearby, hugging his knees, ears tilted toward every word. He didn't understand the details, but he understood the stakes. Each mention of placement, each reference to temporary care, was another shadow threatening to move him again. He flinched at the phrases, though he tried to hide it. Miguel noticed. He closed the notepad after one call and looked at the boy directly. He promised, calmly, firmly, that none of these voices would make him vanish. Later, a knock at the door broke the rhythm of calls. A courier stood with an envelope, thick with forms, instructions typed in official language. Miguel signed, shut the door, and spread the papers across the table. They asked about income, health, criminal history, living conditions. They asked about his past as though it could be reduced to lines on a page. He filled them in carefully, his handwriting square and deliberate, each letter a reminder that he was willing to be judged if it meant Lucas might be safe. The boy hovered at his side, watching the pencil scratch against paper. At one point he asked softly whether Miguel would fail the test. The soldier paused, set down the pencil, and told him that he had failed many things in life, but this would not be one of them. He said it not as comfort but as oath. The afternoon stretched into meetings over the phone, questions repeated by different voices from different departments. One asked about the size of the apartment, another asked about fire alarms, another about whether Miguel had relatives who could step in if needed. Each answer was given calmly, though beneath the surface Miguel's pulse beat with impatience. He had faced interrogations under harsher lights, but never had he felt the outcome mattered so deeply. During a pause between calls, Lucas drifted toward the bookshelf. He pulled down a manual filled with maps and diagrams, flipping through the pages with silent fascination. Miguel watched him trace the lines of rivers and roads with a fingertip. It struck him that the boy was searching for direction in any form he could find, as if a map might reveal a place where he belonged. Miguel joined him, sitting beside him on the floor. He pointed to one of the maps, recalling stories of places he had traveled, deserts where the air shimmered with heat, mountains where silence was heavy with snow. Lucas listened, eyes wide, questions bubbling softly at the edges of his caution. It was the first time since they had met that curiosity had outweighed fear. Evening arrived with rain tapping against the windows. Miguel set a simple meal on the table, pasta with sauce from a jar, and they ate together, the silence less strained now. Lucas ate more quickly than before, pausing only when Miguel reminded him there was enough for seconds. Afterward, they washed the dishes side by side, Miguel rinsing while Lucas dried carefully with a towel too large for his hands. It was a small thing, but in the rhythm of shared work, trust grew. When night came, Lucas hesitated before the couch. He looked at the blanket, then at Miguel, and finally asked if the man would still sit in the chair while he slept. Miguel nodded once, no hesitation, and pulled the chair closer. The boy curled under the blanket, bread still hidden near his chest. His breathing steadied, the tremors easing faster than the night before. Miguel sat in the dim light, the paperwork stacked on the table, the notepad open to half-finished lists. He thought of battlefields and barracks, of orders barked and missions completed. None of it had felt as heavy as this responsibility. Protecting one small life required a different kind of courage. The courage to stay, to wait, to endure the slow grind of systems that measured worth in signatures and stamps. Outside, rain fell harder, drumming against the roof. Inside, a soldier kept watch over a boy who had already become more than a responsibility. In the quiet, Miguel realized the truth. The paper walls could rise as high as they wanted. He would climb them all if that was the price of keeping Lucas safe. And as the boy slept, safe for another night, Miguel knew he was no longer navigating procedures alone. He was beginning to navigate fatherhood. The storm passed by morning, leaving the city washed clean. Puddles glistened on the pavement, and the air carried that fragile scent of renewal that comes only after heavy rain. Inside the apartment, sunlight slipped through the blinds and slanted ribbons, falling across the couch where Lucas stirred beneath the blanket. His small body stretched, and for the first time, the lines of tension on his face softened as though he had slept without fear. Miguel, already awake, was in the kitchen preparing oatmeal, stirring with a wooden spoon that clicked gently against the pot. He glanced toward the couch and saw Lucas blink against the light. Something about that moment, a boy waking in warmth instead of cold concrete, pressed against the soldier's chest like a weight both heavy and welcome. Breakfast was quiet but less guarded. Lucas ate slowly at first, then with more confidence when Miguel pushed a bowl of fruit across the table. When he reached for a slice of apple, his eyes flicked up, half expecting to be told it wasn't his. The reassurance came not in words but in the way Miguel nodded toward the plate as if to say, "Take more, there's enough." The boy chewed, and in the faint curl at the corner of his mouth, Miguel saw the seed of something he had not dared hope for: trust. Later that morning the phone rang with updates. Appointments scheduled, visits arranged, layers of bureaucracy stacking neatly like bricks in a wall. Miguel noted them all in his pad, his voice calm and steady. Lucas watched from the couch, expression unreadable, until the calls ended. Then, tentatively, he asked if the men on the phone could send him away. Miguel looked at him, firm but gentle, and promised that he would never let the boy face those decisions alone. The day stretched into small moments. Miguel suggested they step outside for air, and though Lucas hesitated at the threshold, he followed. They walked down to the courtyard of the building, where rainwater shimmered in shallow pools. A neighbor's dog barked, startling the boy, but Miguel placed a steady hand on his shoulder and explained that barking wasn't anger, only sound. Slowly the boy's shoulders lowered. They sat on a low wall while the dog tugged at its leash nearby. Miguel noticed Lucas watching intently, and on impulse he asked if the boy wanted to hold the leash for a moment. The neighbor, amused, agreed. Lucas reached out, cautious fingers gripping the red loop. The dog tugged gently, and for the briefest second laughter burst from the boy, unrestrained, surprised, alive. The sound startled even him. He clamped his mouth shut as if unsure he was allowed. Miguel smiled quietly as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world, but inside something long dormant stirred. Back upstairs, Miguel pulled a box from his closet, a collection of unused supplies from years ago. Pencils, a stack of blank paper, and an old deck of playing cards. He placed them on the table without comment. Lucas's eyes flicked between them, wary curiosity battling habit. He chose the pencils first, dragging lines across the page in slow strokes. His drawings were uneven but deliberate. A small house, a stick figure beside it, a tree whose branches stretched wider than its trunk could support. Miguel leaned over, pointing gently. He asked if that was the boy in the picture. Lucas gave the faintest nod. He asked who the house belonged to, and after a long pause Lucas whispered, "It doesn't have anyone yet." The soldier's throat tightened, but he simply nodded, leaving the page untouched. As afternoon waned, Miguel set water to boil for pasta, the rhythm of routine becoming a language between them. Lucas lingered nearby, watching as though memorizing each step. The pot filled, the steam rising, the noodles stirred. He began to ask questions, small ones at first, then more. Why was salt added? Why did the noodles float? Miguel answered patiently, each reply a brick laid carefully in the fragile bridge between them. That evening, after the meal, Miguel suggested a game of cards. Lucas didn't know the rules, so the soldier explained slowly, demonstrating each move. The boy's brow furrowed with concentration, then relaxed into cautious amusement when he realized he was winning. Miguel feigned frustration, exaggerating his size, until at last the boy broke into a quiet chuckle. It was fleeting, but it was laughter, real and unforced. When night came, Miguel prepared the couch again, tucking the blanket with practiced precision. This time Lucas didn't clutch the bread. Instead, he placed it carefully on the table, as though testing whether food would truly remain until morning. He lay down, glancing once at the chair where Miguel settled. "Will you be here when I wake up?" he asked softly, the words barely reaching across the room. Miguel answered not with promises but with presence. He adjusted the chair closer, folded his arms and leaned back. His eyes met the boy's, steady and certain, until the child's lids grew heavy. Sleep came easier that night. The rhythm of breathing returned quicker, smoother, carrying no tremors of panic. Miguel remained watchful, but his chest felt lighter. In the space of 2 days, cracks had formed in the walls built by loss, and through those cracks, light had begun to seep. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the quiet miracle unfolding in one small apartment. But inside, a soldier rediscovered the sound of laughter, and a boy relearned the feeling of safety. For both, it was only the beginning of a healing neither had believed possible. The days that followed seemed gentler, as though the air inside the apartment had begun to carry warmth of its own. Miguel and Lucas built a rhythm without planning it. Breakfast shared at the small table, afternoons with pencils scratching across paper, evenings softened by the shuffle of playing cards. Trust had not yet settled fully, but it hovered close, circling like a bird searching for a place to land. Then came the night that reminded them both how fragile healing could be. It was well past midnight when Miguel stirred in the chair by the couch. At first he thought the noise he heard was from the street, tires skidding, a car door slamming, but then he realized it was inside. Lucas twisted beneath the blanket, his small body rigid, his hands clutching at the air as though trying to wake someone who would never wake again. His face crumpled with terror, and from his throat came a sound that hollowed Miguel's chest, a desperate cry for a grandmother who could not answer. Miguel was beside him in an instant, kneeling low, careful not to startle. He spoke softly, grounding his voice in calm certainty, repeating the boy's name until the tremors slowed. When Lucas's eyes finally snapped open, they were wide and wet, searching the room with frantic confusion. He gasped for air, struggling to separate dream from reality. The soldier kept his voice low, steady as heartbeat. He told the boy he was safe, that no one would leave him here, that the nightmare had ended. Slowly, Lucas's fists uncurled from the blanket. He pressed his face against Miguel's shoulder, trembling with the force of tears he had fought too long to hold. For minutes they stayed that way, the apartment silent except for the raw sound of grief spilling out. Miguel held the boy until his sobs quieted into hiccups, until the weight of exhaustion pulled him back towards sleep. Then he tucked the blanket securely around him once more, promising with actions what words could never fully guarantee, that he would remain. But when dawn came, the evidence of the night lingered. Lucas's eyes were shadowed, his movements sharper, as if bracing for questions he didn't want to answer. Miguel didn't push. He moved through the morning with the same calm gestures, stirring oatmeal, slicing fruit, placing it gently on the table. Trust, he knew, was not a wall built in one day. It was a structure raised slowly, plank by plank, and sometimes the storm tore parts of it down. The day carried on with small attempts at normalcy. Miguel suggested they take a walk to the park nearby. Lucas hesitated at the doorway, his hand hovering near the handle as though stepping outside meant stepping into uncertainty. But Miguel waited with patience, saying nothing, until the boy nodded and followed. The park was simple: a patch of grass, a few swings creaking in the winter wind, benches scattered along the path. Children's laughter echoed faintly from one corner, but Lucas stayed close to Miguel, his shoulders tense. The soldier pointed to the swings, asking if the boy had ever been on one. Lucas shook his head, eyes lowered. Miguel led him over, sat on the swing beside him, and with gentle encouragement showed him how to push off the ground. At first Lucas barely moved, but soon the motion carried him higher, the chain clinking softly. A small smile flickered, tentative but real. That evening, back in the apartment, Miguel cooked soup while Lucas drew at the table. The boy sketched two figures side by side, one taller, one smaller, standing in front of a square that might have been a house. When Miguel asked who they were, Lucas whispered that he wasn't sure yet. The soldier didn't press. Some truths were best left unnamed until the heart was ready. As night approached again, Miguel prepared the couch as before, laying out the blanket with care. He noticed Lucas slipping the drawing beneath the cushion, hiding it like something too precious to leave exposed. When the boy settled down, he asked quietly if the nightmares would return. Miguel answered with honesty, perhaps they would, but each time they came, he would be there to face them together. Lucas closed his eyes, holding on to those words more tightly than the blanket itself. Sleep came slowly, but this time, when the shadows pressed in, they found a presence already waiting. Miguel remained in the chair, steady as a guard on duty, watching over the fragile trust that had begun to take root. And though the night carried echoes of fear, it also carried a new certainty, that healing was not a straight road, but a winding path they would walk side by side. Months softened the sharp edges of winter, and life in the small apartment began to carry a rhythm that felt earned rather than borrowed. Paperwork multiplied and then thinned. Visits were scheduled and completed. Interviews unfolded beneath fluorescent lights in rooms that smelled of coffee and copy toner. Through it all, Lucas grew, not in inches so much as in the spaces between breaths. The bread no longer slept beside his chest. The key no longer needed to rest in the middle of the table to prove the door would stay locked. The drawing beneath the cushion multiplied into a stack of careful scenes. Two figures in front of a square that slowly became a home. On a clear morning that arrived like a held breath finally released, Miguel woke before the alarm. The suit he had not worn since he left the service hung ready on the closet door, its fabric brushed, its seams straight, as if dignity could be ironed back into a life. He moved through the apartment quietly, coffee measured, a slice of bread warmed, socks paired and set at the edge of the couch, so the day would begin without hurry. Lucas stirred to the soft sounds that had become his morning music, eyes opening not in alarm but in recognition. His small shirt collar was stiff with care. His shoes were clean. The boy studied himself in the hallway mirror the way one studies a new word on the tongue, testing whether it fits. They left early because early had become a promise against uncertainty. The city greeted them with a thin sunlight that made edges crisp and colors honest. On the bus, Lucas pressed a palm to the window as rooftops slid by, and Miguel counted stops the way he had once counted miles across unmarked terrain. The courthouse waited at the top of a shallow flight of steps, its doors tall, its echo disciplined. Inside, people carried folders like shields. Voices fell to a respectful hush without anyone asking. They sat in a hallway where the air smelled faintly of old wood and recent decisions. The bench was too hard, the clock ahead too slow. Lucas's feet didn't reach the floor. They swung, measured, then still. The boy's hands rested in his lap, folded as if careful not to take up more space than necessary. Miguel kept his notepad in his jacket pocket, not for the lists. No lists remained, but for the weight of all the pages that had gotten them here. He placed it beside him, then shifted it so it touched the child's thigh, a small anchor disguised as paper. The social worker arrived with the calm of someone practiced in ferrying people across deep water. The counselor came too, the satchel lighter now, her eyes kind in a way that did not pity. They spoke softly, the cadence of their words already ingrained in both men. Phrases like temporary placement, home study, evaluation, now fading into the background of this last crossing. Lucas watched their mouths move and then looked past them down the corridor where a door stood slightly ajar, letting out a thin blade of light. It would be there. When the clerk called their names, the three adults stood at once, then remembered to stand at a pace a child could match. Inside the courtroom, the air felt both ceremonial and ordinary, the way important moments often are. The judge's bench rose like a horizon, not distant, but deliberate. The woman seated there had a face made serious by years of listening to stories told under pressure. She looked first at the file, then over it, then past it to the pair at the table. A man once trained to lead and a boy who had learned too early to go invisible. The questions began the way questions always begin in rooms like this. Name, occupation, address. They flowed into others that mattered more. Capacity, stability, intention. Miguel answered steadily, his voice the same one he used when storms pressed against windows at night, low, even unafraid to admit where he was unsure. He did not perform heroics or arrange his past into a cleaner story. He simply told how a night had opened like a door and how he had chosen not to close it. He spoke of routine and oatmeal, of pencils and drawings, of a red leash looped into a small palm and the first surprised laughter that followed. He spoke of a nightmare that had broken open like a glass left too close to the edge and of a chair pulled closer to say without fanfare, "I remain." When the questions turned to the child, the judge lowered her voice half a measure, as though volume itself could be gentler. Lucas did not shrink. He answered in small sentences whose ends did not tremble. He said there was a couch, then a blanket, then nights with breathing that did not feel alone. He said there were cards, and that sometimes he won and the man sighed as if losing were a trick that made both of them laugh. He said there was a plant on the windowsill that needed water every other day because too much kindness can drown a thing. He did not use the word father. He did not need to. The counselor spoke next, then the social worker, their reports stitched from months of visits and notes. They described a home that had been a shelter and had become something else. They named patience as evidence and steadiness as proof. They did not promise a life free of storms. They testified to a roof that would hold. Silence followed, the living kind that breathes. The judge turned a page, then set the file aside and looked only at them. In the stillness, Lucas's feet found the floor. The boy leaned a fraction of an inch toward the man beside him, a motion so small it could have been missed. Miguel felt it as if the building itself had shifted. He rested his palm flat on the table between them, not touching the child, but close enough that overlap was implied. The judge spoke. Her words did not boom, they landed. She said the petition was granted. She said the law would reflect what life had already declared. She said the boy's last name would be written now where it had long lived, beside the man's. The gavel strike was soft, as though even the wood knew there are moments that ask to be sealed without thunder. Outside the courtroom, time resumed its ordinary speed. The hallway hummed. Papers were filed. The social worker smiled widely for the first time in months. The counselor put a hand to her chest and then, catching herself, tucked it into her satchel again. Lucas stood very still, as if listening for an echo that did not come because this decision did not echo. It rooted. They walked back into a city that seemed impossibly, to be exactly as it had been 2 hours before. The bus windows reflected their faces beside advertisements and passing clouds. On the ride home, Lucas took a pencil from Miguel's pocket and drew on the corner of the notepad, 2 figures again, the square of the house now with a small rectangle added. A door open, not shut. He didn't show it, he didn't need to. He tore the corner carefully and folded it twice, a talisman tucked into his palm. At the apartment, the first thing Miguel did was reach for the empty frame that had watched over months of cautious living. He set it on the table and slid beneath its glass the newest drawing, the one from last week where a tree's branches finally matched the strength of its trunk. He placed the frame upright, not because it made the room look finished, but because it told the truth about what they were building. Evening came the way it always came, with light lowering itself across the floor and shadows lengthening gently. Miguel boiled water. Lucas measured salt with a seriousness that felt like ceremony. The plant on the windowsill drank what it needed and no more. After dinner the cards shuffled. The laughter, when it arrived, did not startle either of them. When night fell, the chair took its familiar place by the couch, not because fear demanded it, but because habit can be a tender thing. The boy slept without reaching for bread. The man watched without waiting for the door to move. Somewhere deep in the building, a pipe ticked, the old walls settling around a new shape. Outside, the world went on. 1,000 homes lit, 1,000 stories crossing in the dark. Inside, a promise kept breathing. On another Christmas Eve in another winter, a soldier had entered a bus station expecting nothing, and a boy had curled small against the cold. Now, in a room that had learned to be a home, their lives no longer waited at platforms for departures that never came. They belonged not because paper said so, but because, when night tested their courage, each had chosen the other and stayed. And if sometimes the shadows returned, as shadows do, they found a light already burning, steady and ordinary, the kind made not of miracles but of mornings and meals and the quiet courage of 2 people deciding, again and again, to be each other's open door. Stories like this remind us we're never alone. Subscribe, hit like and leave your thoughts.